Israel has killed more than 10,000 people in Gaza, 4,000 of them children. They bombed schools, they bombed ambulances, and they bombed hospitals. But when challenged on this, they always have one answer. We're allowed to do it because Hamas uses human shields. This was Israeli government spokesman Eylon Levy speaking to Sky News.
The fighting in northern Gaza is going to get dangerous. It's going to get dangerous because Hamas has literally embedded itself under people's homes, under schools, underneath hospitals, and those are all legitimate targets under international law. When Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says the UK wants Israel to win, it wants us to go after these terror targets so they can never perpetrate the massacre again. And we hope that civilians will continue
my
heeding our
understanding of
warning.
international law is that they are only targets that you can aim at as long as civilians are not in the path of those missiles and rockets.
No, that is, so it's important that we're on the same page about international law, and I know that's very important for British, very important for British audiences especially. International law says that medical units may not be used under any circumstances to shield military targets. The fact that Hamas has its military headquarters in the basement of the Shifa hospital is a war crime, period.
Now, that argument about so-called human shields has travelled far and wide. The Washington Post ran this grim cartoon this week. It shows a caricature of a Hamas leader with children, a baby, a woman strapped to his body. And it has the Hamas leader saying, "How dare Israel attack civilians?" Now, I cannot think of anything more dehumanizing. There are entire families dying right now, and you have this sick caricature, right? It's disgusting. The human shield argument isn't just being deployed, though, by Israeli spokespeople or racist cartoonists. Politicians, supposedly of the centre-left, are getting in on the act. Here's Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting on Newsnight.
From what you are seeing, is it carrying out that operation within international law?
Well, I'm deeply disturbed by the scale of civilian casualties, particularly the number of children and the stark warning from the United Nations we've seen today. I acknowledge that for Israel, this is fiendishly difficult because you've got Hamas that embeds itself in civilian populations, uses buildings like schools and hospitals as bunkers to hide within. That's really difficult.
Is it within international law?
I would urge Israel, the Labour Party would urge Israel to remain within international law. When you see,
is it?
Well, look, I think, to be honest, we're going to have to see as the facts emerge and evolve.
Hang on, the UN says it's breaking international law. Amnesty says it's breaking international law. The Red Cross says it's breaking international law.
Well, and Israel needs to act within international law, but any
organisations saying it's already breaking it.
Accusations where Israel is accused of breaking international law need to be properly investigated. And I think particularly when it comes to accusations, for example, of the use of white phosphorus, that is prohibited under international law. When it comes to specific targets, schools, hospitals, they are protected under international law. The complication in international law comes in when Hamas are using those buildings as facilities to launch attacks.
Now, that was the Shadow Health Secretary arguing in favour of bombing hospitals. Now, it's also important to note, right, he said there, any suspected war crime has to be properly investigated. Then he just completely repeated IDF Israeli propaganda that they have Hamas militants in bunkers in hospitals. Now, I don't know either way, but we haven't seen any evidence for that. Yet Wes Streeting seems very, very happy to repeat it on Newsnight if it's Israeli propaganda. But when it comes to the use of white phosphorus, suddenly it needs to be investigated by some independent arbiter. So when it's an Israeli claim, I'll just repeat that. They're using all these hospitals as bunkers. Where's the evidence, Wes Streeting? Suddenly he has this really high standard of evidence when it comes to white phosphorus. I think it's pretty disgusting. We are going to talk you through, though, the reality behind this argument about human shields. It is a category that exists under international humanitarian law, and it is illegal to use people as human shields. Now, it's also the case that the side using human shields does share some blame if civilians die when an opponent bombs a legitimate target. Right, so this is a concept that exists in law. It's not completely bogus. That wouldn't, however, give Israel carte blanche. Now, any attack still needs to be proportionate. Even if human shields are used, it still needs to be proportionate, and killing 80 people at a refugee camp to get at one Hamas commander, as Israel have done, doesn't sound like it meets that threshold. Right, so you can't say, they were all human shields. If you're killing 80 people, I think the majority of them were women and children, you can't say, they were human shields, so it's fine. No, it has to be proportionate. Now, the other question is whether Hamas actually uses human shields. Do its actions meet the threshold of using human shields? Now, we can start here with this definition from the International Committee of the Red Cross's humanitarian law database. So they say the use of human shields requires an intentional co-location of military objectives and civilians or persons hors de combat with the specific intent of trying to prevent the targeting of those military objectives. So you have two things here. First, there has to be the intention to put civilians and military objectives in the same place. So civilian and military sort of infrastructure in the same place or people. And second, when putting them in the same place, it has to be for the specific reason of preventing that military target from being attacked. Now, that means that simply having civilian infrastructure near to military targets doesn't meet the threshold. Of course, to use the previous example, a target being in a refugee camp doesn't make the refugees human shields unless the target is there specifically to use those refugees as human shields. And given Gaza is a very densely populated place, which is being bombed left, right, and center, it's not implausible that civilians and military personnel might just sometimes happen to be in the same place. Israel's argument gets even weaker if we look at the damage done to Gaza as a whole. So according to the UN, a third of all buildings in northern Gaza have been destroyed or damaged by Israeli bombardment. Now you have to ask, does Israel really think that 1 in every 3 buildings is a center of Hamas operations placed specifically there to avoid being bombed? They're using all of those buildings, all of those civilians in them as human shields. Even if they were, does Israel really have persuasive evidence that 1 in every 3 buildings is shielding a military target so impressive, so powerful, that it justifies the destruction of countless civilian infrastructure and lives? Blocks of flats. The reason 10,000 people have died so far in Gaza is because they are bombing all of these civilian infrastructure. Blocks of flats, schools, hospitals, everything is getting bombed, right? And if they can't show that they were specifically using those civilians as human shields and that it was proportionate, then it's a war crime, right? Maybe Wes Streeting should look this stuff up. We can also look at specific claims that Israel has made about particular buildings. To give one example, the IDF published this video earlier this week.
Look at this picture. What do you see? At first glance, you might think this is a school or a hospital, but Hamas sees this as a legitimate place to store weapons such as rockets.
Now, in that clip, you saw this. The IDF says that this opening here is a tunnel used by Hamas to store weapons located in the grounds of the Qatari hospital in Gaza City. The video is clearly being used to justify a possible future attack on the hospital or other hospitals for that matter. There is, however, no evidence. The image shows what Israel says it does, and an Al Jazeera digital investigation has now cast doubt on Israel's claims.
Enter Al Jazeera's digital investigations team, Sanad. It decided to take a closer look at the video behind this latest Israeli allegation. It started by identifying features surrounding this opening and cross-referencing those features with satellite images to determine its exact location. The team also uncovered footage filmed during the construction of the hospital, published 8 years ago. One of the clips reveals the construction of an underground, isolated, and enclosed structure in the exact location of the opening in question. The video makes plain that the construction Israel alleges to be a Hamas tunnel took place while the hospital complex was being built. According to the images in this archival video, this structure is not only not connected to any underground tunnel system, but after further analysis, our digital investigations team found that this structure is nothing more than a water reservoir. To further verify its finding, the team tracked down one of the original engineers who worked on the construction of the Qatari hospital.
عملت لشهور في مشروع إنشاء المستشفى الشيخ حمد للأطراف الصناعية. جيش الاحتلال عرض في الجهة الشرقية من المستشفى فوهة خرسانية، كان عبارة عن فوهة لخزان مياه تحت الأرض، يطل منه فوق سطح الأرض فوهة خرسانية وغطاء معدني وأنبوب للتهوية الذي يستخدم لإخراج وتصريف الهواء بعد دخول المياه إلى الخزان.
By cross-referencing his diagram with the images in the video released by the Israeli army, Our digital investigations team was able to clearly identify a pressure equalization pipe commonly used for water and fuel tanks or reservoirs. Its conclusion, the only thing this video confirms, is that there is a water tank on the property, not a tunnel used by Hamas fighters.
Now, as you might guess, I'm not an expert on water tanks, and I don't claim to be, but that Al Jazeera investigation seems more compelling than the Israeli one, than the Israeli justification. We've seen this square, and therefore it must be a Hamas tunnel. Now, that seems especially unconvincing to me, as Hamas tunnels aren't known to just have clear openings next to public buildings, right? They are military infrastructure. They aren't supposed to be easy to find. Rivka, what do you make of this argument about human shields? It's being deployed by everyone. You saw there Wes Streeting. It's the main right-wing talking point, actually. Oh, they've killed 10,000 people. Well, that's not Israel's fault. That's Hamas's fault because they're using them as human shields. What are Israel supposed to do if there are civilians in the way of their targets? They've got to kill the civilians.
Yeah, it's being used because it's a brilliant loophole for for following international law. Well, we couldn't because these were human shields. I think what's incredible to me is how the international community doesn't consider that the burden of proof is on Israel, who's making these allegations, rather than Hamas or independent media outlets such as Al Jazeera to disprove them. Israel, which has one of the most advanced militaries in the world, which is famed for its intelligence capabilities, although they obviously failed spectacularly on the 7th of October, famed so much that its alumni of its intelligence organizations go on to found the NSO group and Black Cube and become mercenaries for state and non-state actors around the world. Incredible to me that this advanced Israeli military and intelligence operation isn't capable of providing any compelling evidence that Hamas are in fact using human shields. But an Al Jazeera investigation, which Al Jazeera, which has vastly, infinitesimally smaller, amount of resources than the Israeli state, can produce compelling evidence that Hamas isn't using these sites to sort of as bunkers, and therefore the people occupying these buildings as human shields. It's incredible to me that nobody makes that argument. Where is the evidence? You have one of the best funded militaries in the world. Where are the receipts? But I think what's also really important here, and it reminds me of a couple of weeks ago with the massive discussion around whether or not Israel bombed Al Ahli Hospital. Now, I do believe it is important for the media to report accurately on this. I do believe it's important to get to the bottom of who bombed the hospital. But what we've seen since is that Israel has indiscriminately bombed that and other hospitals. Israel is telling us repeatedly that it does not have any concern for civilian life in Palestine, in Gaza, or in the West Bank, and it hasn't for 75 years. We've seen Israel bombing roads that it's encouraged Palestinians to flee across. We've seen Israel bombing ambulances that people are trying to seek medical treatment in. We've seen white phosphorus being dropped. Now, the reason that white phosphorus has become indisputable as an accusation is because you can see it falling from the sky. And so Israel has no way to defend itself against that allegation. So it's just given up on doing that. I don't see why more isn't being made of that. And, do people realize the kind of effects that white phosphorus has? It literally burns your skin right off of your body. So, regardless, it's almost sort of like secondary to me, the question of whether or not Israel is using Palestinians as human shields in specific situations such as hospitals or schools, because we know that it has no concern for Palestinian life in every other thing that it does. It's been shooting people indiscriminately in the West Bank. It's been taking hostages, such as the activist Ahed Tamimi and her father, who's now in administrative detention for 6 months, which could be extended up to a year. These are all very normal quotidian parts of Israeli apartheid that pre-existed and predated the 7th of October and have been accelerating since then. And proving to us day after day, rhetorically, militarily, diplomatically, that Israel doesn't care about human life. So why are we allowing ourselves to become so preoccupied with the question of whether or not Israel is innocent because Hamas is using, under this particular definition of international law, human shields, a charge which it has presented no credible evidence for, and of which there can be no credible evidence produced by, actors outside of Israel, because no one has the resources. Al Jazeera can't be expected to go and disprove every single claim of human shields that Israel is making. It simply doesn't have the resources to do that. I think we should also fundamentally question what the logic of human shields, besides being a sort of a loophole in international law that kind of lets Israel off the hook, what that suggests about Palestinians. It suggests that Palestinians are not human beings, but human shields. It dehumanizes Palestinians and renders them simply these kind of bargaining chips or sort of pawns in a conflict, when actually we're just talking about ordinary people who have not asked for this and who are not waging this war. So I think we really need to try and understand why it's been such an effective rhetorical and sort of argumentative approach by Israel, because it just feeds into the idea that Palestinians are not human beings to begin with, something that the West, because of our sort of Israel propaganda saturated media environment, is primed to believe. Whereas on the flip side, as we were saying earlier, where if every Palestinian death is a terrorist death, because either they are terrorists or they are shielding terrorists, every Israeli death, including the deaths of sergeants and majors and lieutenants and corporals in the IDF, is an illegitimate death, is a tragedy. You know, Adam Schatz, in his piece for the London Review of Books about Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, described the first phase of that operation as typical guerrilla warfare and targeting legitimate military targets. But, we're now in a position where every Palestinian is fair game and every Israeli killed is a terrorist attack.